Welcome to SIPA Forum's Digital Day. I'm Bill Echikson, the Acting Director of SIPA's Digital Innovation Initiative. We've assembled an exciting panel here with us to discuss the key challenges for keeping the West ahead in the digital race. Vladimir Putin's Russia is exporting surveillance technology. China represents a significant competitor with an authoritarian vision of the internet. How is the West able to compete? On our panel, there's Ylli Bajraktari, CEO of the United States Special Competitive Project. That's a bipartisan, nonprofit initiative that makes recommendations about how to maintain the US's lead in emerging technologies. They've just put out an important report on the subject. Mr. Bajraktari is the former executive director of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Next, we have Marie Larsen, Denmark's tech ambassador in Silicon Valley. Prior to her appointment, she worked on tech for the World Economic Forum. And finally, there's Markham Erickson, a Google vice president based in Washington. He leads the global team focused on the application of law and the internet. Let's jump right in. Could each of you tell us just what you believe the Western priority should be to fend off the threat from China, Russia, and other authoritarian states and stay ahead in technology? Maybe Ylli, you can start.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. So as you noted, SCSP, we just launched our first report last week. It's called Mid-Decade Challenges to U.S. National Competitiveness. I think going back to your intro, one of the main challenges we face that in this decade, we will probably determine whether or not we're going to live in a world where technologies are built by democratic countries or technologies are going to be dominated by authoritarian regimes. And I'm here focused mostly on China. I know you rightfully pointed out the current crisis we have regarding Ukraine, but when you look at it globally, when you look at what China has achieved in the last couple of years in building and deploying technologies, whether 5G or AI or any other technologies, we face a serious competitor that is building a digital global infrastructure. And then by the end of this decade, if we don't get ourselves organized and resourced properly with our allies and partners, we risk living in a world that is really dominated by the Chinese technologies. So to that end, what we argue in our report last week is we need to come together with all the democratic countries, to include our closest European partners, and to build a vision about how we're going to run these technologies and then how we're going to offer it to the rest of the world. And I think there are three ways we can do this. Number one is we need to build a joint vision for the future where technology will really plays a dominant role in our life, in our economy, and ultimately our national security. And so to that end, I think we have some really serious efforts underway. The US-EU TTC is really the step in the right direction in getting together with our European partners to determine the way ahead. The second piece we got to do to really get ahead of this problem is really not only build a joint vision, but also rely on each other's comparative advantages. In some areas, Europeans will always be ahead of us. In some areas, they already have better platforms than the United States has. So for example, in 5G, United States still doesn't have its own offer to the rest of the world, but it has to rely on the 5G platforms that are built by Sony Ericsson, and Nokia. And so we have to complement each other. We have to develop a holistic list of technologies that we have to stay ahead because they will ultimately be good for our economy and our society. And then lastly, we've got to find a way to regulate them that is based on our values and norms. So I'll stop there, Bill, but happy to answer any questions.
We'll continue on. Ambassador Larsen, how is this challenge perceived in Europe and in Denmark, but Europe as a whole?
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you to SIPA for the invitation to be here. It's a great pleasure. How is this perceived in Europe? First of all, I think there's a very strong sentiment that we share that this is not to be left for previous conversations and only around innovation or only around commerce or only around defense, but that technology is geopolitics. And we need to, I think, what should the priorities be? And I think from a European perspective, I want to mention four things. First of all, we need a strong defense for democracy in a digital age. The idea that we could always count on the democratic institutions to prevail, that more and more of the world would sort of turn towards the Western ideals around democracy turned out not to be right. And now the strong defense of upholding democratic values, respect for human rights in a digital age is ever more important. Secondly, that also requires alliances and partnerships. From a European perspective, that's first of all, truly working among the 27 member states and making sure that our approach to this issue is united, is strong, is also, I think, a realization of maybe we haven't done enough as Europeans in both one thing is governance, but a second one is on the technology development. And then three, I think there's this making sure that if we are to succeed with the Western priorities, Western values around this that are more than transatlantic, I think it really goes to democracies around the world. We need to make sure that technology delivers in some of the global challenges that we're seeing. If we are not to see turn away from the belief and optimism around that technology can and support a more peaceful, a stronger, a more democratic, a self-governing opportunities around the world, I think that the growing tension around technology and geopolitics will only increase. So making sure that we develop technologies that are delivering on social, environmental challenges, better education, better health systems, tackling the climate crisis is a very, very necessary, not only European, but a transatlantic priority.
Okay, thank you. Let me just ask though, does Europe really, or follow up on the question, does Europe really see China as the same danger as the United States, as a not only a competitor, but as an authoritarian threat that we should avoid trading with, avoid selling and buying from above all? I mean, if we looked at telecommunications, Europe is still buying from Huawei, parts of Europe.
There's no doubt that the European relationship with states around the world, including China, is changing rapidly. The European stance on China is right now threefold. It's China as a partner when it comes to combating climate change, is a competitor on economic issues, and it's a systemic rival when it comes to governance systems and values. Recently, and I think, in this sort of geopolitical landscape, we see technology, be that AI, quantum, 5G digital infrastructure, are increasingly taking center stage in geopolitics. And that is also not only now, but I think in the months and the years to come, changing how Europe sees itself in the world. What I think is more important is not only defining ourselves in relationship to others, but talking about the European project. Right now, Europe is squeezed between two of the sort of extreme, right now the main poles in developing technology. And I think as Europeans, what we're now doing is that we are not just left on the chessboard in between these two great players. Europe needs to be a player too. The discussions around strategic autonomy, I think from a Danish perspective, we talk about open strategic autonomy. So the ability to engage with the rest of the world, while also ensuring that Europe, on some aspects, we need to be not entirely dependable upon the rest of the world, but we need to be also stronger and a little bit more independent. Secondly, the other piece around this is to ensure that we actually, from a European perspective, believe that some of the norms and values around how we govern technology should not only benefit the 300 million plus, 350 million plus Europeans, but they can be part of setting global norms around the world. And to that end, I don't see it as a, sort of a few years ago, we talked about it, a Chinese, an American, and a European approach to internet regulation and tech development. I really think we talk about a transatlantic, a democratic alliance approach to how we perceive technology development and governance and regulation, and a more authoritarian one. And in that one, I believe that there's more that unites than divides us between the US and Europe, and that going forward, it's not only defining European policy based on sort of those two extreme poles, but going more and saying we are an alliance of democracies that are finding the need for collaborating much more on these issues together.
Yeah. Let's bring in the view from the private sector. Markham, we've been talking about the challenge from China and whether US and Europe see it in the same light. How do you see the challenge from China? And do you see both Europe and the United States working together to respond?
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon. Thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here and spend some time with Madam Ambassador and Ylli. Really appreciate the conversation. Look, there's no doubt that in the last few years we're seeing a once-in-a-generation set of challenges. The war in Ukraine, of course, but dramatic strains on fiscal resources. And these challenges really center around what we're going to do about addressing jointly the global economy, global security issues, including issues around geopolitical security in China and sustainability. And we believe at Google that technology companies must rise to the occasion and play a central role in participating with governments, civil society, and NGOs to do this. And I do believe the EU and the US have a strategic role to play here and a constructive role to play. As Executive Vice President Dombrovskis put it last year, the bottom line is that there's no stronger values-based alliance in the world than the one between the EU and the US. But I do think there's going to be some challenges here that we have. And one is we've seen a further erosion of the rules-based trading system. And there's a long-standing trend across a number of sectors, but we're seeing it most clearly in the areas of digital economy as countries increasingly turn inward around the globe and protectionist around the globe. I saw one report recently that noted that over the last 10 years, the digital economy saw twice as much discrimination against foreign firms than tangible goods trade overall. Second, increasing digital fragmentation and misalignment is making it harder for allies to work together. Countries around the world already are moving away from the 20-year consensus around the open internet by passing restrictive rules that nationalize and fragment the internet. And I think the result of that is a trend toward making the internet less secure, less interoperable, less safe. This fragmentation already was a significant concern before the Russian war in Ukraine, but since February, the dynamics around the war and Russia's approach to sovereign internet regulation have deepened existing fissures and fault lines, pouring oil on what was already a fire. And in all, the G20 nations, and we're coming up on a G20 meeting, but they've adopted over 1,700 legal and regulatory steps for the digital economy just in the last 2 years. And so this is a regulated space. The concern is that it's being done without any real degree of coordination or alignment. And then that feeds into a concern around the third point here, which is that there's a broader trend of digital authoritarianism. Governments are seeking to use the internet and misuse technology in ways that violate fundamental rights as a vector of misinformation. War in Ukraine has highlighted that, as we've seen. So these three trends around rising protectionism, fragmentation, digital authoritarianism, I think they require a concerted action by the U.S. and EU. I'm hopeful that will happen. The TTC is an important venue for the U.S. and the EU to coordinate, but I'm not sure the TTC has risen to this challenge yet. I'm hopeful, but the rules we set with the U.S. and the EU will impact global trends and norms. So I'm hopeful at the end of the day that we'll see that. And on the security point, let me just note, last week we released a white paper in Europe with some ideas and thoughts about cybersecurity and how governments and the technology sector can work together to improve security. One of the tangible recommendations we make is that the EU could require a security assessment when it considers regulations, much as it does in other areas like sustainability, so that we look at those files relative to does it tend to lend to making for a more secure space in Europe or a less secure space.
Yeah, thank you, Markham. I think those are many of the key points. When you hear the private sector and the European representative talk about a common front, do you think we're achieving that, or a common digital European-American alliance, or not? Or do you think that we're drifting apart?
Well, I think in a sense, Russia has inadvertently strengthened the coordination and the relationship between the United States and Europe, and geopolitically, and between U.S. technology companies and Europe. We've worked very closely with European stakeholders, European governments on cybersecurity hardening and on dealing with misinformation and government state-sponsored hacking. So that's been positive, I think, and the values that we share are positive. I think where we still have work to do is aligning over approaches to regulation that threaten that are not consistent with those trends of interoperability and openness. And so I'm hopeful we will do that. TTC, I think, gives us the venue. I think the values are there, the execution, the implementation, and I think hopefully using this moment to broaden the perspective from focusing on state sovereignty issues. There's a lot packed into that, and there is a role to play around state sovereignty. We support that, but not in a way that potentially fractures the internet and makes it less secure.
Yeah, I mean, let's try specifically talk about one of those issues, which is the trend to data localization. It's visible, at least in Europe, as a growing trend to keep the data within Europe or even within national borders. How dangerous do you see that? And let's turn to maybe Ylli for his feeling about data localization.
Thanks, Bill. So I led the AI Commission for the last 3 years. The purpose of that commission was really to focus on what can we do more with artificial intelligence for national security purposes. And all the data you look at, and no matter from what point of view you come on this issue, is that in this decade, we're facing a challenger that has a signal fusion, that has enormous volumes of data that they can rely on to build their AI platforms. And so what we have argued time and again is that we should look at this from a holistic perspective. And what Markham was saying too is like, and I was highlighting earlier, we need to sit down and really understand, and I think the Ukraine crisis really highlighted a lot of these things, that the era of great power competition is still here, is still around. And while Ukraine and Russia is, the closest alligator to the shore, China is still continuing to build and deploy platforms around the world. And I don't want to sound here very alarmist, but when you look at the 5G or a 4G global map, China has already developed 70% of the Africa 4G network. And so think about the future we will have to wake up in 2025 through 2030. Their strategies and goals call for everything made in China in 2025, for China being AI global leader by 2030. And so while we're talking about these small pieces of how we're going to govern these issues, I think what we're missing is we miss a joint democratic vision. In our newest report that we just issued, we call for a DemTech alliance, where you can bring a set of coalitions. And these don't have to be coalitions that we are used in the past, like NATO, or we're seeing Quad today, but these can be technology specific. We probably need a coalition that we can offer to the world on 5G, As you know, on the chips piece, if it wasn't for us and the Taiwanese and the Dutch working together, we would not be still enjoying the advantages of the cutting edge manufacturing on the semiconductors. And so we have to be specific about which technologies really will yield the most benefit for our societies and our economy, and then create these coalitions around them with our allies and partners. And Europeans are really at the forefront. I cannot think of any better allies that we have in this space than Europeans. So how do we get together to build these technologies going forward? The third and the last point that I would like to make is, during the Cold War, our governments were in charge of innovation. Most of the stuff coming from our labs, our universities, were really what we enjoy today, from the internet to the maps and everything else. After the Cold War, I think the trend really moved towards private sector taking the lead in the latest and greatest, because the government cut its R&D spending. I think in the 2020s, we have to move now into some kind of a public-private model where we bring together technology companies and our governments to really understand, number one, the threat posed by these technologies, what can we do about it, but ultimately really decide how are we going to use these technologies to improve our, social well-being, economic prosperity of our citizens, and make these technologies really be ruled on our democratic norms and values. And I'll stop there, Bill.
Well, let me just follow up on artificial intelligence and regulation in general, not just on industrial competitiveness, but Europe, and Ambassador Larsen expressed it, wants to be the global regulation leader, set the rules for tech. On artificial intelligence, it's the first to propose a regulation being debated now here in Brussels. How do you see that? Is that compatible with the transatlantic alliance and the common front against China?
Thank you, Bill. So I've spent a lot of time in Brussels, and I'm really close to both the rapporteurs on the AI Act. I think it's good that Europeans are moving ahead with trying to put some kind of notional boundaries on what that means. I wish we as the United States would move into defining this, because you have the China model of how the AI is going to be ruled, and then you have the European model. I think my biggest concern about the AI Act is the whole notion that overregulation will lead to European innovation. I've yet to see concrete models of how that would work. There are no historical examples that heavy regulation led to innovation or spurred innovation ecosystem. And so my concern to my European counterparts is time and again of like, look, have you done a cost-benefit analysis of how this act would really generate economic growth in the European continent? So that's one. As you know, in our system, anytime the White House or Congress recommends any kind of bills, we have the Congressional Budget Office that does the cost-benefit analysis of those bills. I'm told that Europeans have not done that cost-benefit analysis of this bill, so that's one. And the second piece is, while you're rushing to regulate this kind of a technology, we should sit down together, and I think this has been done through the TTC channels, on what are some of the things we have to get together at minimum in how we're going to govern AI or any other technologies before you move out and you start regulating one in particular. And by the time even this regulation is regulated or passed, the technology is moving so fast that you have, as I said, you have to go back and like, what kind of mechanisms you're creating between private sector and public sector that we stay ahead and that we provide these technologies to our citizens and increase their welfare compared to what China is doing with their regulation.
Ambassador Larsen, I think that's an opening to you to respond. And as the European representative on this panel, how do you perceive this, partly criticism that you're sort of going off by yourself and regulating without a cost-benefit analysis?
Look, I think this question of over-regulating, for more than 20 years, this whole sector has gone completely largely unregulated. And it's been moving fast and in the process broken a bit too many things. Some of the conversations that we're having, it's certainly not regulation for the sake of regulation. It is a genuine concern that I find not only in the public in Europe. I live in California on a daily basis. I find a lot of Americans concerns over what are the implications to my children from spending a lot of time on various social media platforms. What are the the polarization that we're seeing in countries around the world, and frankly, in some of the strongest democracies where polarization is, potentially breaking over countries. This question of how do we uphold and secure our democratic institutions? Maria Ressa, the Nobel Peace Laureate, saying with all the mis and disinformation that's used both by, we see it from sort of state-sponsored influence campaigns to, individuals and groups trying to change the narrative, anti-Western narratives. The mis and disinformation war going on is taking hostage truth, because we don't have a shared set of facts, and without facts you can't have truth, and without truth you honestly can't have functioning democracies. So I don't find this as overregulation. I find this to be a genuine response to a public and a political concern that this has gone largely too unregulated, that some of the decisions that are now left up to the tech companies, which is why in so many of my conversations with the tech companies, there's been a very frank saying, look, you have to regulate us. It should not be us to decide what stays up, what goes down, how to make decisions around, tackling mis and disinformation, how to uphold cybersecurity, without the government also stepping up and frankly taking the responsibility that is of legitimate democratic governments to help set the basic framework and boundaries for how technology should be developed. So, I think the cost benefit analysis that has been done is saying we've in the past 30 years, we've never seen such a threat to democracy as we're seeing right now. I'm not saying that is because of technology, but I'm saying technology plays such a huge part. It is a fundamental infrastructure of our lives, our communities, our democracies, our businesses, the way our markets are operating. And it is a responsibility to get that right. So that is the approach I think, we're taking as Europeans. And I think that, in my conversations with companies around DSA or DMA or even the AI Act, if we expect every piece of legislation to be absolutely perfect, we haven't been paying enough attention to how political processes are made. These are negotiated outcomes that I think actually a lot of not only Europeans but citizens around the world and companies see there is some sort of fairness in, and that they're addressing some of the challenges. They're not addressing all of them, which is why the engagement and the dialogue with tech companies around this is so incredibly important. We still need a lot of that. For me, living in Silicon Valley, the very society that these companies were created from was open, free societies, democracies. They believe in science and opportunity to start businesses, to thrive, to engage globally. If we're not going to be sort of sowing over the branch upon which we're sitting, we need to support that tree, which is democracy and open societies. And then just I want to say a last comment around how, from how are we sort of, working in a world where globalization is radically changing. The past couple of years have shown us, one, that we are now living in a time where one crisis is following the next one. And so the vulnerability and the fragility that we're seeing in our global systems, if we are not to see, frankly and physically high walls going up, we need to address some of the challenges, incredible vulnerable supply chains, and some of our, value chains around these issues where we are dependent and have, too strong dependencies on individual actors. We got to work with our allies, and I think both, Ylli and Malcolm alluded to this, to figure out, this is about countering digital authoritarianism in many ways. That requires strong collaboration. I don't think we can do that also without setting the right governance framework for this. I think that the sort of DemTech Alliance and various sort of think tanks and individuals, and frankly, some of the work that Denmark is doing, both with our allies on this, we have a network of cyber and tech ambassadors pointing to exactly to this. How do we collaborate both on sort of chips, not only chips, but technology development, setting rules of the road, and gating around, who is going to set the standards? Is that going to be the West or someone else? So I think that is the cost benefit analysis that goes a little bit broader than just sort of simply economic terms, but figuring out, how to prevail society. And then if I can make one last point, we've been a Danish example, I think, we're one of the leading when it comes to renewable energy. It's been a sort of a windmill fairy tale for the past 3 decades. And that's come because there was a strong public-private collaboration, partly through regulation, partly through a more carrot approach, incentivizing and supporting. And what we're doing here is saying we need more tech, we need more innovation, but that has to support rather than undermining our democratic institutions, that has to support sustainable development. And that is the partnership with which we're going into this, I think, future with the tech companies as well.
Thank you. I mean, I think no one would disagree that we need regulation in what has been new responsibilities in an area which hasn't been regulated, but many of the European regulations target disproportionately, perhaps just because of where the companies are located, American companies. So I was wondering, Markham, these new European, how do you perceive this drive to regulate the internet? Companies like you, are you telling us, please regulate us?
Yeah, so from our perspective, it's not about over-regulation or under-regulation, but smart regulation. I know that can be a trite phrase, but Sundar was our CEO, Google CEO, is one of the first, if not the first, technology CEOs that called for regulation of AI in Europe, because we understand that their governments need to assure that there is trust and accountability in that space. We think a sectoral-based approach is the right way to go. I think as I look, stepping back, as I think about this, clearly there's regulations that are happening. I do get concerned sometimes when we see discriminatory application of those regulations as a way to prop up sort of local entities. And that's point one. But the larger point is, I think often the regulations are developed in a silo. And so, regulation that has to do with privacy may not take into account things like safety or security or competition. So sometimes competition provisions will mandate that we share data with entities without a thought to the security implications of that. We'll understand the desire to try to foment the sharing of data to help other entities, but there needs to be that consideration. Or in the child safety space, there's a thought to locking down information and to giving parents total control over the experience of the child without looking at sort of issues around, security-related issues and openness and access issues for the child. So the UK is conducting kind of an interesting approach where they're trying to have a more holistic view that brings in privacy experts, security experts, competition experts, privacy experts. I think that would be helpful. We've seen, for instance, that some of the things that we've done at the request of the EU governments on misinformation with Russia would have been harder to do with some of the interpretations of DSA if they were put into place. So, thinking through as we consider regulations, a holistic approach, I think is going to be important. The other thing I'll note is that why it's so important for the US and the EU to get this right is the rest of the world is watching, and countries that may not share our values will often take provisions that are developed in our regions in the US and EU, but with a slight tweak to them, or with a execution that would not be consistent with our norms, but they're using the precedent of what we do. So we need to have a thought toward how these similar provisions, things that we do in the EU and the US, if those provisions were adopted in a different country, how they might be used. And I think of things like, putting criminal liability for people in the companies in the country for content removal decisions, where it then becomes very difficult for companies to be able to protect democratic norms when their people on the ground are faced with threats of imprisonment. But I'm ultimately hopeful because we do share underlying values here, and I think we're in a moment where we're trying to get it right. And I think some humility on the part of companies as well as regulators to try to work together, to collaborate, to share information, to try to get the balance right here is ultimately the end with NGOs and consumer and citizen input is going to be crucial, because many of these solutions are not easy to come by, and that's one of the reasons we continue to have these kind of discussions.
Yeah, thank you. Ylli, I mean, one of the themes that seems to come up in a lot of the comments is Europe is regulating, but America is not. it's abdicating. Do you share that feeling? Do you think America needs an AI law, a privacy law?
And so I think what we argue in the report we just released is we have to come up with an American model of AI governance. And I think because our political system is so fractured between state and federal government, and then you have three branches of government, right now there's so many initiatives going on. There's so many bills in Congress. I think the White House is also trying to get ahead of this problem. And then you had at the state level, laws that California has passed. I think in the coming months, we, as Special Competitive Studies Project, will try to project and present like what that model would look like. I think we have to get ahead of this. I think we have to try to find a way that balances innovation regulation in our country, because as Ambassador said, our citizens are also concerned. We have to have a model also because right now it looks like only Europeans and the Chinese are out there debating and passing these kind of laws. So in a nutshell, I think in the coming year, we have to come up with an American model of how would this look like going forward, and what are the boundaries of these technologies that we have to use for the benefit of our society, but also to counter what the ambassador was saying, a lot of disinformation that is coming from our adversary. And so I think we will get there. It took 2 years for the CHIPS Act to be passed, so I don't envision this road to be easy because there are many stakeholders. This is a democracy. Civil society plays a critical role. Private sector plays a critical role. So ultimately, we have to find our way of how we're going to see the use of these technologies going forward.
Thanks. We only have a couple of minutes left. So I'd like to go around the table and just have some final thoughts on key priorities for that transatlantic digital relationship. What would be the 2 or 3 things that we need to do? Ambassador Larsen?
Thank you so much, and thank you for, I think, a fruitful conversation and discussion on these issues today. One, we're really got to stick to the fact that there's more that unites than divides us. I think whether it is the work at the TTC, the question before is Europe regulating American tech companies? Unfortunately, we don't have enough big tech companies in Europe. Otherwise, they would certainly be regulated too. But this has to be seen as an alliance between democratic forces, whether that is the amazing companies coming out of Silicon Valley, or it is European governments that are stepping up to the responsibility, frankly, which is, if we don't do it, as Ylli said, either one, there's going to be someone else setting the global standards and governance around this, or two, we're going to see a tech backlash. We'll see Luddites, on the street, and we'll start seeing some of that polarization in our societies, deepening even further. So let's make sure that this is, I think as we're sort of coming out of the siloed approach to a lot of this in the past, and I think some of the pieces of legislation coming out now really representing a nuanced balance between innovation, privacy, security. That's why, for me as a tech diplomat, this is not about sort of lobbyists against government. This is about partners meeting around the table, trying to solve some of the real issues together. So in that vein, I think this collaboration and partnership is key.
Good. Markham, some final thoughts from the private sector?
Yeah, so for sure, the EU and US have to prioritize promoting closer strategic transatlantic cooperation. I think that starts with security. There has to be an increasing emphasis on cybersecurity threats and how we can address those, including disinformation, as the ambassador said, disinformation and misinformation. How do we do that? How do we have responsible AI regulation? How do we promote responsible AI? That's going to be increasingly important. Avoiding discriminatory digital regulation. I think, and I understand where Europe is coming from with regard to US companies and trying to foment industries in the US. I don't think this is a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And I think the concern, if it is framed that way and is thought to be that way, that becomes impossible to scale globally. It becomes a race to protectionism and to breaking up the interoperability and the openness of the internet, which, by the way, makes the internet more secure, that openness and interoperability. So it gets to the first point. And then I think developing some international technology standards, some standard settings would be would be helpful, again, to help with that interoperability. So I'm hopeful. I think the TTC does provide at least an immediate forum to address some of those priorities.
Thanks. And I think the final word, Ylli, it's up to you.
I think both the ambassador and Markham said the right thing. I think we have to come up with a democratic alliance of the technologies really dominate our life for the good, and then try to find a way of how we can regulate them so we avoid harm to our societies. I've said it time and again that China has a list of technologies they want to dominate by the end of this decade. The list is public. Xi Jinping talks about that list of 9 technologies every time he has a speech on technologies. I think democracies have to decide what are the technologies that will benefit our society for the rest of the century. Invest there, increase joint R&D, people exchanges, everything that we have done right during the Cold War, everything we have done right since the Cold War. I think we should rely more on the opportunities that bring us together than differences that take us apart. But I think there's a lot of conversation in this space, and I think usually when friends talk about these things, they usually come to joint conclusions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to all 3 of you for a really fascinating discussion. I think there's a lot of reading to be done. Ylli, share your report. Markham, we're going to read about tech and security in your report, and I'm sure, as I said, we're putting out some work about Denmark's success in spawning tech unicorns and trying to keep them in Denmark. So thank all of you. You can view the CEPA forum, the agenda at cepa.org, cepa.org, and you can watch the CEPA forum, of course, CEPA's social media. Thanks for joining us, and continue to tune in.